Hi, I'm Brian from Beyond CAD. Beyond Typical's version 3.0 is now available. This latest version includes some really exciting and powerful new features, like new 3D assets that can be customized within your model, and new copy and paste functionality so that you can duplicate placed assets, custom labels, and even entire sections between projects. Also, we've added some new multi-section editing and labeling functionality that'll make your builds even faster. Plus, we've added some new sloped lanes for you to try out. There's lots to show off, so let's dive in. Welcome to version 3.0 of Beyond Typicals. At first glance, it may seem very similar to previous iterations of version 2, but that similarity is intentional as we've aimed to ensure seamless compatibility with your version 2 files. So if you started a btip file in a previous iteration, maybe version 2.3 or 2.5, you'll be able to open those in version 3 and continue working on those projects. Some of the background improvements may not be as readily apparent. That includes upgrading from Unreal Engine 5 to Unreal Engine 5.2 so that we can continue to offer the most cutting-edge visual graphic functionality and features of Unreal Engine in Beyond Typicals. Plus, we've enabled a new setting called Nanite on some of our 3D assets to hopefully improve the performance and frame rate of Beyond Typicals in your working sessions. Nanite is basically a setting that you can enable on 3D objects to dynamically change the quality or resolution of those objects depending on how close or far they are from the camera. So on our 3D grass, this is probably the biggest culprit of slower frame rates and crashing for some of our customers with maybe weaker GPUs is the 3D grass has a lot of polygons. So there is a lot for Beyond Typicals to render. And when Nanite is enabled, when you pull that camera back, now those grass blades are a lot lower quality. They have fewer polygons, and it's really hard to see here. So it's a dynamic setting aimed to improve the frame rate and have Beyond Typicals run more reliably on your computer. If you wanted to measure your frame rate, you can always go to the visibility settings and turn on this show FPS toggle. You'll get this box here at the top that will show the frame rate on your computer. Anything in the 20s or higher is going to be a nice smooth working session in Beyond Typicals. Now, we have a lot of great new features in these menus here on the right, but I'm going to start down here at the section hierarchy and show you that there's some new ways to select and edit sections, especially multiple sections at one time in version 3.0, whereas in version 2.5, if you wanted to select multiple sections, you had to hold Control in the section hierarchy and select these sections one at a time. Now you are able to do that in model view. So I'm holding Control and I can select multiple sections here in the model view. But you can also use Shift when you select to select multiple adjacent sections. So I can first left click on this tree section and then hold Shift and click on this common lane section. And you'll see how in model view, I've selected all of these sections from trees to common lane, and you can see those highlighted and selected here in the hierarchy as well. I can also use that functionality in the hierarchy. So select trees, shift click to shoulder, and I've selected all those sections. You're also going to see a lot more of the multi-lane editing capabilities here, where previously all you could edit was the height of multiple sections. We've now enabled more multi-section editing functionality like renaming sections, changing the widths, changing the primary assets, adding underground pipes, changing labels, adding pathway arrows, area highlighting, and changing textures. All of this is going to be a little bit limited depending on what types of sections you have. There are going to be some differences. So in a case of the width, some of our sections have a maximum width. So you can see as I stretch this shoulder section out, the shoulder section is a 20-foot maximum width. And when I do select multiple sections, it's going to show me the properties of the last section that I've selected. So if I use the shift select over to trees, now it's going to show me the trees section, which has a maximum width of 100. But all those sections that I have selected do have maximum widths and minimum widths pre-programmed. So the shoulder is going to stay at a maximum of 20, the sidewalk can go to 30, and things like the curb are going to be much narrower. And on the flip side, I can make this really small and get those sections down to whatever the minimum width is for those sections. I'll also show you that you can adjust things like primary assets. So for this selection that I have here, I can change the spacing of the primary assets. So you'll see how the striping spacing changes, the grass spacing changes, and these trees change as well. But you'll notice the grass in this tree section isn't changing with that. And that's because that grass is the secondary asset here. So I can make those adjustments here as well with the secondary assets. One limitation here is going to be that the drop-down lists for assets are different for a lot of the different sections. So if I go to trees and look at the fourth line down, I'm getting beech tree 2. But if I go to the shoulder section, the fourth line down is this bollard 1. And on the common lane, it is this backhoe. So let's go ahead and select all of those, and I will change this to the fourth line down, and you'll see how I'm getting the bollard, getting a bush, getting trees, getting this backhoe in those different sections. So while you can make those positional changes all at the same time, things like offsets and spacing and rotation, it may be a bit limited for assigning assets to different section types. The rest of this new multi-section editing functionality includes things like adding and modifying underground pipes underneath the sections all at the same time, or even our bridge substructures under bridge lanes. Plus, you can do things like modify multiple section label styles all at once, and even add pathway arrows or area highlighting across your typical section so that you can get that consistent look across the width all at once without having to make those same changes over and over on individual sections. Similarly, you can adjust the pavement texture for your roadway by shift selecting all of those roadway lanes and modifying the textures accordingly. We've also added some new functionality to the folders in the section hierarchy. And these existed in previous versions of Beyond Typicals, but we've created a lot more functionality to folders that should be a lot more useful in speeding up your designs and giving you some more intuitive label options on your section. So you see I've got about a half a roadway here. What I can do in the hierarchy is basically select a bunch of adjacent lanes and quickly put these in a folder. So I can right click on this and either click wrap with folder or press Control F on my keyboard. And what that does is automatically take that selection and drop it into a new folder in the hierarchy. Now that that's in a folder, we have some additional functionality for that folder. And you can see that by right clicking on the folder, and you will see a duplicate and a mirror option. So I can take this whole group of sections and quickly duplicate it. And then what I'm going to do is drag this folder above the grass median and use that mirror option and reverse the order in which those sections appear. So I used lanes, shared use path, trees, and reversed it to trees, shared use path, lanes. And now you can see I've quickly taken half that roadway and filled out the rest of it with only a few tweaks remaining, like reversing the direction of traffic by flipping those lanes. Also, we have a new ability to add additional section labels in your model using these folders in the hierarchy. And this label option gives you the ability to label a span or a group of adjacent sections all at once so that you can do things like add a curb-to-curb dimension or right-of-way to right-of-way or eastbound and westbound or merge labels above a shared use path. So I'll show you kind of how that works. So I click this label button here next to the folder, and what pops up is a menu down here that is very similar to our automatic section label menu, where you can do things like turn the label on and off, change its position, change the font and colors in that label. All of that would be included down here on the right for these new section folder labels. To turn that label on, all I have to do is click Enabled, and you'll see I get a new folder label that by default is a little bit above those automatic section labels, and I do have positional control over that label that I can move those forward, back, up, down, and basically be able to add additional labels to multiple sections within the model. You'll see it's by default titled New Folder. If I change the name of this folder, let's call this Westbound, you'll see that the name of the folder is automatically tied to the label, but you can also do things like override the dimension, hide the units, override the dimension text, and override the label text, similar to how these automatic section labels work as well. This is also a much more intuitive way to merge your labels above adjacent sections. And I've offered tips for this in the past, and there's some workarounds that you can do with section labels to do something like label this as a shared use path that's 10 feet wide. But more intuitively now, you can just take those two bike lanes, press Control F to put them in a folder, and in the hierarchy, add a label to that group of sections, and then turn these bike lane labels off and adjust this label so that it replaces those two bike lanes with a label that says shared use path. One other thing about these labels is you also have a multiplier. So if you, for any reason, need to label a little bit less or a little bit more than what's in a folder, you have the ability to kind of shift these vertical leader lines left and right, and you'll see how the dimension will update. This is basically a multiplication factor of the center to the outer edge of that label. So if you multiply it by a factor of 2, it's going to take half of that width and double it and adjust the measurement accordingly. That just gives you a little bit more flexibility over these section folder labels to basically repurpose this as you need it in your model to label groups of elements in addition to the individual lanes. There is some great new functionality in Beyond Typicals version 3 that's going to allow you to duplicate some of the work that you've already done in your typical section model. And that includes things like copying and pasting sections, as well as placed assets and custom labels to help you save time by taking some of the work you've already done and copying it in a model or into a new project altogether, instead of doing something like recreating a custom label from scratch each time you want to reuse that label. I'll cover the latter two first because our placed assets and custom labels operate very similarly. So I can select this parking block asset here, and you can see that it's got a specific XYZ location, it's got a specific XYZ rotation, and also it's been scaled disproportionately in the X, Y, and Z axes. And down toward the bottom of this asset placement editing window, as I scroll down, you'll see there's some new buttons here in version 3 that allow me to duplicate this asset for a number of different methods. The first is basically duplicating the asset in place. So as I click this asset, you'll see additional copies of that parking block be placed that are tied to that section and just moved over slightly. We don't want to place these assets directly on top of where you copied it from, so we actually move them over 50 units to the right in the Y direction and 50 units forward in the X direction, and those units are centimeters. As I continue to duplicate that parking block asset, you'll see that each of those parking blocks are still tied to the original section from where it was duplicated in place. And then I can take those assets and move those around if I need to put those elsewhere along that section. But I'm going to delete those duplications of that parking block and then show you that you also have some positional control as an option with this duplicate asset on mouse button. So I click this button and you'll see that that same parking block, rotation and scale, modifications and all, are coming with my cursor. As I hover elsewhere in this model, you'll see that the sections that I hover over are being outlined in green. That's to indicate which section I'm about to place this asset down on. So when I left click to place this parking block on this shoulder over here, you'll see that this shoulder section now has that same parking block, again, stretched and rotated from its original properties on that new section in the model. You may also find that you want to take a placed asset or custom label and put it into a different phase or a different project altogether. And that's where our computer's clipboard comes into play, because the first two asset duplication buttons will only duplicate that asset within your model. But if you do want to put it into a different project, you are able to copy this data to your computer's clipboard. And this actually copies as a text string. So I'll paste it into Notepad, and you can see that there's a long string of text keeping the properties of that asset or label. And now I can go to a different phase or a different project altogether. So let's place a common lane in this section. And now I can click on this lane, and you'll see in the asset placement menu for that section, there is a paste from clipboard option, or I can press Control V on my keyboard. That's going to paste that same parking block with, again, the same rotation, same scale, same XYZ location onto a new section in a different project or a different phase. I'll head back to that original phase and show you that now that that parking block is copied to my clipboard, I can also paste this to more than one section at a time. So using the Shift click to select multiple sections, I can now press Control V and also paste that parking block to all of the selected sections that do accept custom labels or placed assets. I'll also show that copying and pasting custom labels operates just about the same way, where when I select that custom label, I'll enter into the custom label editing menu here on the left, and scrolling to the bottom of that list shows that there are some new buttons there to duplicate that label in place, or attaching that label to the mouse to go duplicate it somewhere else within the model. Plus, I can copy that label to a clipboard and enter into a new project or a new phase and select a section and paste that label from the clipboard. We've also added copy and paste functionality for entire sections of Beyond Typicals. And this is a question I've fielded a lot of people basically taking the time to customize a lane away from its default values once they bring it into the model. So adjusting things like width and texture and traffic, or maybe placing assets or custom labels on top of it. And they want to take that section and move it elsewhere, whether it's in a phase they've already created or use it in a different project. So what we've done is given you that copy to clipboard functionality. So you can use Control C and Control V to accomplish this, and basically take a section that you've already created, press Control C, and now when I press Control V, you'll see that I'm in a placement of that section mode where I can place that somewhere else in the model. And you can see this particular section actually has some placed assets that have been moved away from that original section location. Let's undo that and create a new phase to show you that that section can actually be pasted into a new phase or a new project altogether. So this should really help speed up the workflows for duplicating full sections from project to project or between phases in your project. This is limited to one section at a time. There's a lot of data that needs to be stored to your computer's clipboard, but you could just select one section at a time and then paste those in one by one to duplicate that work between your different phases or different projects. The sections menu has been reorganized slightly, where we've taken some of our sections and maybe placed them in a different order, as well as taking some of the groups of sections like grasses and cut and fill slopes and place them into folders down here at the bottom. So if you're looking for multiple options for curb and gutter, those are all grouped up and ordered pretty intuitively down here toward the bottom. Keep in mind, you can always search for a section using the Search Sections button here, where I can type in something like grass, and this will search all our sections for either tags, like the raised median is tagged with the word grass, as well as showing all those grass sections. This function works similar to the tabs here up at the top, where I can clear that search and also click something like wall and get a list of all the wall sections in Beyond Typicals. One of our new sections is the striped buffer. So that I can bring into this section. Let's place it between the lane and shoulder here. And I've covered this in a separate video showing how to get these stripes assigned to a shoulder section. But this is a popular enough modification to the shoulder section where we just made it its own section now called striped buffer. And you'll see it has a stripe short asset placed at an angle, spaced at 25 feet. It's a default of 4 foot wide. But you can also do things like add a secondary asset like bollards or delineators to that section. Keep in mind when you widen this out, those stripes aren't going to widen with it, so you may want to adjust the x-axis scale of that stripe short to make sure that it fits the full width of your section. If you scroll down the section list, you'll see that one of the new folders is called Sloped Lanes with a beta tag. And this is a new set of sections in Beyond Typicals where you can actually place lanes in your model that have a cross slope. And we've only provided a few options here, but this should be a good starting point and enough to get some feedback from those users that were requesting this in Beyond Typicals. And eventually, hopefully, we can take the beta tag off and maybe develop this out with some additional lanes like sidewalks and bike lanes and things like that as well. But for now, we've just got a few different lanes and shoulders. And the one thing I really want to highlight here is that similar to our cut and fill slopes, these are static 3D objects. So what we can't do, at least yet in Beyond Typicals, is give you a section with a constant cross slope. But we do put the starting cross slope in the name of these sections so that you know that as its default, what height it's dropping across its width, and be able to keep note of that original cross slope. So this lane at 10 foot and 2% is dropping 0.2 feet across its width, regardless of how wide I make it. So if I were to change this to 5 feet, it's still dropping 0.2 feet over its width, and this is now a 4% lane. On the other hand, if I make it 20 feet, I've now got a 0.2 foot drop over 20 feet, and therefore it is a 1% lane. So keep in mind that starting name configuration, it's also listed up here in parentheses so that you know how high this is changing as you line up multiple sloped lanes across your model. So let's change this back to its default width and duplicate it a couple of times. So I can press Control D on my keyboard or press duplicate right here. And now I've got 4 versions of this lane, and you can see already that I've duplicated that lane, and I can see that cross slope across all 4 of these, and knowing that that's raising up 0.2 feet from right to left, that I'm going to get that seam as these are all duplicating at that original height of 0 feet. So to build out a sloped roadway, I'm going to need to take these lanes and move them up to reach the seam of the previous lane. And I definitely recommend starting from the lowest elevation of roadway, because what you don't want to do is start dropping these lanes below a height of 0. You can see how that affects the subgrade from left to right. So let's bring this back up to 0, but I actually know that this should go up to a height of 0.2 so that I can get rid of that height gap between lane 1 and lane 2 here. So let's adjust that height to 0.2. And this next lane over here, if I want that slope to keep rising, I should raise that up to 0.4. And once more on this lane up to 0.6 to know that that mathematical difference in height is carrying all the way across regardless of how I change the width of these sections. So I can actually change this width, and I've still got a flush seam here on either end of the lane because it's always dropping that 0.2 feet across its width. If I wanted to make a crowned roadway, what I can do is take this section and flip it. I could also mirror it, and that differs just a little bit where the traffic would still head forwards, but I've changed the slope of that lane. I'm going to mirror that back and use the flip commands so I can have oncoming traffic. And you'll see that these sections are definitely too high now, so I'm going to lower those back down, knowing that this one needs to be at 0.2, and then this one goes back to 0. And now we've got a crowned roadway, and let's head to the 2D camera and front view so we can see that a little bit better. You'll see that our traffic is tilted as well, so those tires do meet the pavement surface of those tilted lanes. Now let's talk striping. So I've got a couple stripes on the edges here, but I'm going to use the S command on my keyboard to add some linked striping to these sections that are in the middle that were duplicated. And you'll see that I'm missing some of these stripes. So in particular, this stripe along the crown is not being seen, and that's because our default striping in Beyond Typicals is using a function of Unreal Engine called decals, which are intended to just be seen on a flat surface. And because these lanes aren't a flat surface, if there is a linked stripe to a sloped section, the one on the higher end probably won't show up if it's linked to that section. So what I can show you is this stripe here is linked to the lane on the left, which is the lower edge of that, and that's why we see that. But if I were to take this stripe and to link it to the one on the right, it's now being linked to the lowest surface elevation of this lane and therefore being hidden because it's 0.2 feet down below the surface of that lane. To mitigate this, you could adjust which lane you're linking that stripe to, but we've also given you some advanced settings when you select the stripe. So if you see down below these color shortcuts, there's a pull down called Advanced Settings. What you can do is toggle on alternative striping. And what that does is replace the decal stripe with an actual 3D object of striping. And what that does is give you some control over position and angle of that stripe. So it's still down below, but what I can do is pull that up with a height offset. And now I can see that on the pavement surface as I raise and lower those 3D objects of stripes, which are no longer decals. This shouldn't affect anything else. You can still adjust spacing and color and double striping and things like that. You're just getting some more positional control over the stripes that are adjacent to these tilted sections. You can also tilt these too. So if you need that extra specific positioning of those stripes, you do have a tilt option as well as a horizontal offset option where you can move those a little bit left or a little bit right while tilting those and moving those up and down. So we've given you that functionality so you can make these adjustments to the striping, especially next to sloped lanes. Now let's take a look at the Assets menu, which has probably undergone the most change compared to all the other new features and improvements in version 3. And right away when I open this Asset menu, you'll notice that all our library assets are now tucked away in these categoried folders where previously it was just a big long list of thumbnails that weren't necessarily sorted in a way that made things easy to find. So we've tried to resort things and put them into these categories so that you can go find them better. But keep in mind that we've also got this search bar down here at the bottom where you can search for keywords that can go find those assets for you. We've also even added some new tags to some assets to where you may call an asset by a different name, where previously, if you didn't know this was called delineator white, you had to search for the word delineator or white to see that when you've filtered out that search. But now we're able to add tags like candlestick and flex post to this to be able to pull up these assets if you call them by a different name. Let me clear that search and head to the Dynamic tab, where we've got a lot of our new assets that are in version 3. And this is a fully new feature to give you some customization power over these 3D objects that you pull into your sections. So we've created things like certain street furniture elements. We wanted to give you the ability to refinish those and add a different color to its surface. And we've wanted to be able to give you dynamic transit vehicles so that you can take a bus or a train and change, the length of it and the color of it and the text for the route destination. We can give you signage where you can change the text. We can give you construction vehicles that actually have animations that you can choose from, but also these building block shapes, which you can pull into a model and retexture and resize to hopefully build things with these that maybe fill out your model a little bit better. So let me show you how this works. I've already got a dynamic fire hydrant here, so I'll bring that into the model and kind of show you how this works. So I've clicked and dragged from this Your Dynamic Templates section and pulled that fire hydrant into the model and placed it on this section. When I select the section, you'll see for dynamic assets, it will have this additional circle with a pencil icon indicating that you can edit the properties of that placed asset. This pencil icon is pretty much the same thing as this pencil icon up here, where when I've pulled that into a model or not, I can still make changes to the surface texture of this particular asset. So now I've made this fire hydrant green, and again, I can make that change here or in the asset menu. And we've given you a few shortcuts to be able to change those quickly to more common colors. You can also rename this fire hydrant. So when you start with a template, you'll see that this is called dynamic fire hydrant. It creates a unique number in brackets afterwards to help you understand the differences where maybe you might want two different colors of fire hydrants in your model, or two different signs with text, or two different bench colors. So that number is added to the end of that to create a unique version. And then you can rename them as well. So if I wanted to rename this as yellow fire hydrant or yellow FH, I can do that, and that might make this a little bit more organized and easy to refer to later. I'll show you a couple different examples. So let's take a street light and a bench and a recycling bin. So I'm starting with these templates, and I can bring in that street light and bring in that bench. Let's bring in a couple of those benches, and then the recycling bin. Again, for these street furniture elements, really the customization you're getting is just changing the surface texture color of that element. So I can make that street light all white or maybe all red. I can adjust this bench and maybe get a fuchsia color on that bench. And then we can head to the recycling bin. Maybe we want to see a more black or dark gray finish on that metal surface. So again, you can take these elements in the dynamic asset menu and add that customization. And for street furniture, it's generally just surface color. Let me show some of the animated construction equipment. So let's pick a roller and a grader. Let's do an excavator. We've got a few more, so you can play around with these, but we'll pull in the roller here, the grader, and the excavator, and we can kind of show you some of the options that you have here for these animated construction vehicles. So I'm going to take this roller and actually move it over, and you'll see it still operates like other 3D assets, but it is going to start moving because this is an animated asset. So I can take this animation selection here and choose from some different options. For the roller, it's just a forward movement. So you'll see after I select forward, it's going to start moving. And then these animations loop. So after it reaches the end of its preset scripted animation, it's just going to reverse and head back to its original starting point, which is still indicated by this selection tool back here. You also have some other editing capabilities. You can choose the speed of its animation, so I can speed that up or slow it down. And sometimes you can do other things like turn on exhaust or dust under the wheels of that animated construction vehicle. Just take a look at a couple more. We've got our grader, very similar animation here. You can move it forward, but you can also change the rotation of the blade beneath that grader. And now let's take this excavator and move it over and show you that we've got a few other options here on this one, being a forward movement, but also some different digging animations. So we've got a digging animation where it kind of rotates off to the left side. It's got a trenching animation, so it can dig forward and then dump off to the left. And then a deploy where we just kind of get this rotation animation. And again, you can speed these up or slow these down. You can also pause these most times, where you can turn off play and basically just choose a starting position. So for some of these, if you really want to see that maybe in a static rendering, but you want to be specific about where that construction vehicle is operating, then you can pause that and choose which position in that looping sequence it stays at. We also have some new transit vehicles in our dynamic assets that can be brought into your Beyond Typicals model and customized, and that includes a dynamic bus, and a dynamic train. And the first thing we need to do to get these into our model after creating those from the template is to click on that asset, which brings up all the different section types of Beyond Typicals. And what we want to do is turn on any of the sections where we want to see that vehicle. And a shortcut could be just to click Enable All, which will just select all the different sections in Beyond Typicals. And now we would see the dynamic bus in the drop-down list as a primary asset. Or we could just go find the specific section types. Like here we've got a train section, which I can toggle on, or the raised rail, like so. So now that we have this dynamic bus and this dynamic train as options to be chosen as a primary or secondary asset, I can take that section and go select that dynamic asset so that it appears as moving traffic along that lane. I'll do that for both of these two lanes so we can get a view of both of those buses at the same time. And then what I'm going to do is pause traffic once the vehicle is actually in the model so that when I do make changes to this asset, I can see them in real time as those changes are being made. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the dynamic asset area, click that blue pencil, and you'll see that I have a bunch of options to make changes to this bus, including things like changing the destination sign name. So I can change that from the default of Beyond Avenue to maybe Main Street. We can add passengers inside that vehicle. We can choose an articulated bus model in addition to a non-articulated bus. We can do things like change the color of that bus surface. So we can first adjust the roof color. Let's maybe make that all white. And we can adjust the rest of the exterior as well. Maybe we can go to more of a reddish color. You can also click this color wheel and choose from colors that way as well. So you'll see as I press play that those buses that are assigned to these lanes are coming in with those customizations, which should definitely help match the style of the transit vehicles in your municipality. You'll also notice that this bus has a Star Transit image as default, but that is something that you can actually replace as well. So there's a custom sign image option here that allows you to import an image to replace this one. And in this case, what I'm going to do is pull in a Beyond Typicals logo to replace that. And you can see how that sits there on the surface in place of that Star Transit image. And we can even do things like move that sign up and down, forward and back. For articulated buses, we have rear sign offset controls as well. And you can also scale that image up or down. For now, there's going to be a little bit of limitations on what you can do with scaling. You see if we get too big, that image starts to come off the bus and maybe onto the roadway. But for now, this is a good option to add a little bit more realism to your transit vehicles. And also, if you don't want to see this image, what I would suggest you do is just change that sign scale down to 0 and it will vanish. Our dynamic trains operate very similarly. I've already placed that dynamic train into the primary asset options for these two sections. So let's go ahead and change those to our dynamic train. And I'll pause traffic so we can make changes to that train. But this has a few more options than the bus. For instance, we can add additional passenger cars to that train. So we have a sliding scale for how long you want that train to appear. We also have an option to add a power car to the back end of that train as well as the front. We can swap out the roof of that train to have electrical equipment if this is kind of a streetcar type of train that you're trying to show. We can also add passengers to the train as well as add a destination. So we can do Main Street here as well for that, for the nose of that train. We can also change the length of that power car's nose. So we could look at something a little bit more low speed and local, or a longer power car length for maybe a high speed bullet train. Similar to the dynamic bus, we have some surface color options. So you can play around with those. And we also do have a custom decal area here as well, where square images work best, and those do appear on the passenger cars, and those can be moved forward and back, up and down, and scaled as well. We've also got some new custom signage in our dynamic asset area, so you can create some of those from templates, we have our dynamic custom sign, which is just emissive light text on a black background. We've got a dynamic arrow board, and we've got a trailer mounted road sign, and all of these can be customized as well. We'll start with the dynamic custom sign, where I can take that sign and change the height and width of that sign, but also change the text. So we'll just add another line that says test text, and you can see how that populates as I make that change. You can do things like change the color of that emissive light text, but it works a little finicky because of how bright that light is. So you might need to play around with some of those settings, but you can change things like font size and alignment, as well as choose from a few different fonts for those signs as well. The dynamic arrow board has just some different light behaviors, so different flashing patterns like arrows flashing left and right. We've got some diamonds and lines, multiple arrows, and some sequential arrows as well. So plenty of different arrow patterns there to use in your construction projects. And then lastly, a dynamic road sign here, which operates very similar to the custom sign. It's just mounted to this trailer hitch where you can fill in some test text here, change the color, change the font, change the size of that font, and the justification of that text on that sign as well. We've put our RRFBs and hawk signals, as well as some school zone crossings here. These are basically some other library assets that we had where we would just create a bunch of different options based on whether it's flashing or not, or which flashing pattern. So here we've kind of bundled those all up. So instead of choosing from an RRFB or a hawk that's on or off, you can now use this dynamic signal and choose your flashing pattern as part of the dynamic customization for that individual asset. And then we've got some really great new features to help you bring out more realism in your project. And each of these is going to have a unique use case. But if you've come across needing to do this, I'm sure you're going to appreciate this because I've got a lot of value out of this already just in testing the tool. But basically what we wanted to give you were some building blocks so that you don't have to go create a simple 3D shape in SketchUp and import it in. You can just choose from these as kind of a starting point. So let me show you a few different ones. I can pull up this box and a cylinder, a cone, and then let's do a couple of these curb and gutter arcs as well. So we're just starting from a very simple 3D geometric object, and I've given those options there. But this is now a starting point that you can use to create custom elements or shapes within your model. So while this starts as a box, I could stretch this maybe in one direction and get a wall or something along those lines. Or you could create terrain with this. Or in a situation where maybe you need a manhole, you can bring in a cylinder and scale that up nice and large. Let's do maybe 4 feet. And then we can bring in this truncated cone, get that up to 4 feet as well, and just place that right on top of that cylinder using our arrows to move these assets around. Also keep in mind you can scale these things disproportionately, so maybe we want to see that a little bit shorter. But you'll see that each of these building blocks kind of has a starting size, and we've tried to give both imperial and metric starting size options so that you know that a 1 foot box is 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot. So if you know if you want to build something that's 4 foot high, you can scale that Z direction 4. Or if you want it 10 foot long, you can make that an even 10 foot scale. So keep those starting measurements in mind if you do need to create things to scale using these building blocks that we've given you that information here in its dynamic settings. But also what's really cool about these is you can retexture them using any of the textures that are already in Beyond Typicals. So that includes like our brick paving, our grasses, our metals and plastics and woods and things like that. So you might be able to create a wood wall just using these building blocks instead of importing in something from, a different software. Let me also show these curbs and gutter as these starting point building blocks. So we have a 90-degree arc. So you'll see that this curb and gutter turns a full 90 degrees. And we've also got a 45-degree arc. And I've used these in example projects to basically build my own curb bump out or curb extension, but there might be some other ways to use this as well. But again, similar to those other building blocks, you can click the properties of this and choose from some starting sizes. So in the curb and gutter, we've given you some preset radii because you can't just take a 10-foot curb and gutter and scale it up 2, because all components of that scale up 2 as well. So if you do want to choose from a different starting radius on this, that's what these sizes are here for. Also, we've given some metric options for those as well. And then again, you can change the surface color of these things or change the surface texture of those, but ultimately giving you some ability to basically build your own bump out depending on its geometry. And those 45-degree arcs work really well to help do some switchback curves. There's also a straight piece of curb and gutter in here to connect the dots between those curbs and gutter as well. So as I'm placing these, I want to show that the 45 arc also has an in or an out curve. So again, I can change, if I make a change to one of these, it will change both. So in an instance like this, I would want to create a separate 45-degree arc where I can use this as a starting point and create a separate template. And again, renaming these can help, where I could call this the 45 out, and I can call this one 45 in. Let's change this to a different color as well. So we'll do green. Now we can move that down, change this to an in curve, so it kind of has the other curve orientation with the same radius. And we can move that into place and start creating something like a bump out on our roadway. The last dynamic asset example I'll show is our static pedestrians. So we've got a static pedestrian here, and I'll start with that template. This is someone you can place into your model, and if you really want to fill out a scene, you might want to create maybe 5 or 10 different pedestrians, because each one of these is something where you can choose from a different person, and we have 63 different models. You'll notice the last 2 of these are construction workers, but basically a lot of our pedestrians that are in the pedestrian set are also in here. And then you can also add an animation to these pedestrians. So similar to the construction vehicles, we have choices for things like sitting and talking, some texting. We have working on a device, some waving options, pushing a button, and digging, which kind of puts a shovel in their hands and looks pretty good for these construction workers. So I've used these to fill out a scene, whether it's a bunch of different people standing at a transit platform or working in construction. These are really nice to just add some realism to a video animation or static rendering of a project. Another important thing to note about dynamic assets is this folder icon on the right, where you have the ability to export this customized asset and use it in other projects or give it to somebody else, maybe in your organization. Where if you've taken the time to create a specific wall or maybe even customize a dynamic bus for a city, then you'll be able to take that asset and put it into a new proprietary file type for Beyond Typicals called a BTA file. So you'll see here as I'm exporting this dynamic asset, it's saving as a .bta. It's created a random file name. I'm going to cancel this because not only can you export these one at a time, you can also export all your templates. So there's a new option here in the dynamic asset to either import a BTA file or export a BTA file in case you want to reuse these customized assets in other projects. Also, those options are in our file pull down where you can export all custom assets, which would not only export your dynamic assets, but would export any imported assets you've put into here as well. Again, kind of putting all of these into a file, and that BTA file can support multiple dynamic or imported assets and let you pull those into other projects. So I'm going to click Export All. You'll see it starts with a file name of multiple BT assets, but I could just use this to say test2, and this is going to save as a BTA. Let's put it in my downloads folder. And now when I go to start a completely new project, let's actually start with the default project, that my dynamic templates for this new project don't include anything that I just worked on. But if I go to import a template file and head back to my downloads folder and load that BTA file, you'll see that that box that I retextured as wood, that the cylinders and curb and gutter options are all in here with those same properties that I customized in the previous working file. Another thing I want to show you is that you are able to delete these assets out of the working file. If you don't want to see that excavator in this file anymore, you can delete that template. And you'll see that that asset is still placed on the section, but when your dynamic template has been removed from the file, it's going to be replaced with this red exclamation point to inform you that there was a placed asset here, but it is no longer in your working file. So as I delete all of these unique dynamic templates, I get a bunch of red exclamation points indicating that used to be a dynamic asset that's no longer in the file. There's some options here with these red exclamation points. You can either delete these out, understanding that they're no longer there, or maybe you wanted to just leave them in place or not worry about them for now. We have a new visibility setting where you can toggle off showing missing assets, just in case they're not there. Maybe somebody else worked on something and had deleted it out, and instead of deleting out a bunch of those red exclamation points, you just want to not see them. That's a visibility setting that you can take care of as well. Another new feature in our assets menu is this tab up here titled Expansion Packs. And we've designed this as a delivery system between version updates so that we can provide some downloadable content for things that aren't included in your Beyond Typicals download, but that you could use in your Beyond Typicals models moving forward after it's installed. And you'll see already we have one expansion pack available to everybody. This is our Metahuman Pedestrians expansion pack, where we can provide some higher definition pedestrians that look a little less plasticky than our regular pedestrians that are included in the model. I've already got this Metahuman Pedestrian Expansion Pack installed. It is 12 gigs, so it can take a decent amount of time to install. So we'd recommend that you leave maybe an hour or two with Beyond Typicals open while this does install. But once it is installed, you get this pull down here at the top as an installed expansion pack. And that's where you can choose your cycling metahumans, your jogging metahumans, and your walking metahumans, and assign those as moving traffic to different sections. So I'm going to take the walking metahuman and turn on the sidewalk section to say I want that new asset available in a sidewalk section as animated traffic. And now that walking metahumans appears in my drop-down list. And let's unpause traffic. And what you're going to see is a little bit of a hiccup. And this might happen for some users, maybe not all, but those are higher definition pedestrians. So as they spawn and enter the model, Beyond Typicals may just pause for a couple of seconds. But you can see how much more realistic these pedestrians are comparatively. Let's move this other guy a little bit closer so we can get those side by side. You'll see that our walking metahumans just have a little bit more realism in facial texture, in hair. The hair can even kind of flip, so there's some physics to the hair. So it just looks a little bit more realistic and is an option if you do want that enhanced realism with your 3D visualizations. We can also use this expansion pack system to issue you more assets either on demand or if maybe your whole organization would benefit from a certain pack of assets that we can offer before we go to a version 4. This is something that we can key in on a certain subscription ID and maybe give this to a set of customers depending on whether they've asked for it or maybe even purchased something in the future. We currently don't sell any expansion packs, but there is a future where maybe that's something we can provide at an additional cost for those customers. So we want that functionality to isolate the customers that get these expansion packs when they want them. As an example of this, I just created a handrail asset and included it as a new DLC pack for my subscription. When I click Refresh Expansion Pack List, it's going to check our server and see that yes, there is a new handrail DLC pack. I can click Install, and then it downloads that to my machine and now gives me a new expansion pack that's available in Beyond Typicals, where I can click and drag and pull those assets into the model or assign them as repeating assets along a section. We've also made some drastic improvements to imported assets in version 3 of Beyond Typicals, and especially in version 2.5 and those earlier versions. Importing assets was a really great function and feature we could provide, but it also had some inconsistencies and some workflows that were just difficult to make changes to those assets if they didn't import incorrectly. For version 3.0, we paid a lot of attention to the surface texturing, making sure that things are coming in more consistently and that you're able to make changes a lot faster. First, I want to compare this to version 2.5. So I've got 2.5 open, and I'm going to import in this playground asset that I got on the SketchUp 3D warehouse. And you'll see when I import it, it's a plain white object. Basically, all of the surface colors that were assigned to it in SketchUp have been lost, and it comes in just plain and white. And we did give you this texture customization area where you can actually reassign textures or change the colors of these different elements on that asset after it's been imported. But you'll see that this asset has hundreds of surfaces. And if I wanted to make a change to what these surface textures look like, I'm going to have to do that hundreds of times, and there's really not any clear indication of which surface I'm changing while I'm doing it. So this became a very tedious process to try to get the surface textures of your imported assets correct in version 2. In version 3, however, we've basically added some streamlining to this, where when you bring in that same asset from SketchUp, first of all, it's going to have more of its textures brought in. So we're going to lose those surface textures less often, and you're not going to see as many plain white objects that you were seeing in version 2.5. But also, when you import it now, you're able to merge these surfaces together. So those surfaces that all have the same colorization or the same surface texture are now all merged together as a single surface in your retexturing menu here in the imported assets. So this makes changing a full color of an asset a lot easier, or maybe even replacing a plain surface by using one of the textures that are already included in Beyond Typicals. So with these changes, we're making imported assets a lot easier to bring into your model and a lot easier to make more specific and more real alongside your roadways. Also, I'll use this same playground equipment to show that we have some new glass textures in Beyond Typicals. So for our sections, heading to the texturing menu, now at the bottom of this list, we've got 3 new glass surface textures that you could apply to different elements of the roadway, but these are probably more useful on those imported assets. So I've got that playground equipment here. Let's take that green surface and use the paintbrush icon to choose from the surfaces in Beyond Typicals, and we'll reassign that plain green surface with one of our glasses, and you can see that now we've got a glass surface on those elements. So just another feature in Beyond Typicals that should help make things a little bit more realistic if you're importing in buildings or maybe some custom vehicles. We now have glass surfaces as well, and there is an option when you import these assets to actually automatically detect those glass surfaces and replace them. And sticking with this playground equipment, I'll also show that our placed assets also have a new feature in the asset editing menu to either hide the model and keep the shadows, hide the shadows and keep the model, or hide both and it just becomes an invisible object. The hide model feature while keeping shadows will be really nice for projects with photo compositing where maybe you need to match a shadow from the background image but have it appear over your surface model, like in the case of a tree or a building or a bus shelter, like some of these examples here. In our rendering menu, we've made a slight tweak to the render image buttons, where previously in Beyond Typicals, we had a toggle for if you wanted to take a screenshot of your model or whether you wanted to include screenshots with transparency. So our render outputs are PNG files. We're now giving you the option in just two buttons, whether you take a screenshot image of the model with the background and sky, or whether you want to take a screenshot with that alpha transparency, which splits that view into two different images, one of the modeled elements plus one of the background. So instead of toggling things on or off, you can just choose between these two options, depending on which type of image output you want to see. We've reordered our example project list a bit. Mostly this just consisted of reordering the projects so that they are grouped together a little bit better, with some of our more diverse projects up top, and then groups of things like urban designs and bridge projects and phasing and things like that further down the list. Keep in mind, if you do want to filter this list out for certain types of projects, we have these buttons here at the top, or if you just want to see safety improvements or construction projects, those filter that list pretty well. You can also clear that filter and type in a search term. If there's a specific example project you're looking for, you can do that in this field at the bottom. Also keep in mind that we do have more example projects on our website. So there's that button there at the bottom that brings up a website where you can view a lot more projects that are available for download. If you do see something of interest and want to see how that was made, you can either click that thumbnail to see a video of how we put it together, or download that BTIP file and open it up on your computer. Also, in case you weren't aware, if a project interests you, you can click the name of it, and that should pull up a previous video we've made about how that project was created. We've also gone through and updated some of our example projects to include some of the newest features in version 3. So this small downtown reconstruction project has some dynamic assets like our animated construction vehicles. And this trail crossing project now has a new phase in it with sloped lanes. So I suggest you do browse through some of these example projects in version 3 that you may have been aware of already, because we might have added some elements that could help show you how these new features work. We have a new photo compositing example project in version 3. That's this fall drone composite project, which I've got open here. This project is great because it shows off another camera angle that you can use to do photo composite projects. It shows off tricks that you can do with foreground images that kind of cover up the model, as well as background images, and advanced techniques like placing shadows onto a roadway so that it enhances the realism of your composite projects. Sam's already got a video describing how this was put together. It was part of our previous Compositing with Sam video series. So click this link to check out a YouTube video where Sam goes into more detail about how he made this. The highway construction staging example project is new in version 3 of Beyond Typicals, and I've got that open here and can just walk through some of the unique aspects of this project. You'll see it's a long section. I've stretched this out to 1,000 feet in length. It's a 6-lane divided highway with shoulders and a cable barrier median running down the center. You also see I've got some slopes on the outside, with the underground soil surface texture and some pine trees and rocks as repeating primary and secondary assets down the end conditions of the section. You'll see I've also got some placed assets here on the right of this first phase, where I've got our empty sign structure asset, but also duplicated to the other side to make it look like it spans the whole, let's say, northbound side of the road. But then I've also got a placed asset here on that sign structure, and this is one of our new dynamic assets. So I'll open our asset library, and under the dynamic tab, you'll see that I'm using quite a few of our dynamic assets, and most of those are in the second phase here, which I'll get to in a second. But in this phase, I've got our dynamic custom sign here, and you can see this is sign 408. So when you create an asset from a template, it will give it a random number to make sure it's unique in your project. But this sign 408 here, you'll see when I edit the properties, has the roadwork begins April 1 text here. You can do things like customize the size of that sign, the height, the color of the text, and things like that. But basically, once that's done, you can pull it into the model and add it to a section and then start moving it up into place. So this is a great way to get signs up on to structures by using a combination of the sign truss asset and our dynamic custom sign. In the next phase here, you'll see we've got quite a bit going on where we're using some area highlighting to show work zones and lane closures. I've also placed assets like this white stripe where I've elongated it and rotated it to make it look like a lane merge here. And alongside that are some more of those dynamic assets where we've got a dynamic road sign where you can customize the text that appears on that sign. We've got some other library assets like this construction sign and a dirt pile, but then we've also got some dynamic pedestrians. So this is one of our new dynamic assets where you can choose which person appears in the model and then also assign an animation. So here we've got one pedestrian with a texting animation and another with the digging animation, and you'll see you can choose which person, and then the last two in this person selection are construction workers. Behind that, we've got a dynamic arrow board, which is another one of our new dynamic construction assets, where you can choose from different light sequences that flash on that arrow board. And then behind that, some of our dynamic construction vehicles. So we have things like backhoes and excavators, and we've got a roller over here. But essentially, you can place those into your model and choose from different animations and starting positions and speeds. Sometimes you can even add exhaust or dust. So it's worth exploring these. These can really bring your construction visualizations to life when you play around with some of the settings and animations of some of those dynamic vehicles. And finally, this is the new Stormwater Spread example project, and I put this one together to show another use case for Beyond Typicals using some of the new 3.0 features. And that includes things like sloped lanes and folder labels so that we can do a little bit more visual communication of certain design elements of our roadways. And in this case, this is something I've come across in my career where maybe you are adjusting the spacing of your inlets in your gutters in urban areas to make sure that in heavy rainfalls, that water doesn't spread too far into adjacent travel lanes away from that gutter. So let me head to the 2D front view that I've saved here to show those sloped lanes. You can see we have a crown on the roadway at the center line, and I've taken two of our sloped shoulders and actually repurposed these by retexturing and editing the width of these to a gutter and basically a parking lane. And between the curb and the gutter that I've got here, I've also placed a water plane, which I can then use to raise or lower the water and show that spread differently into those adjacent lanes. Then I can show that I added a folder around that gutter and parking lane and use that new folder label function to add a label to indicate how wide this spread is. So I turn that label on, I overrode the text to Stormwater Spread, I changed the label color settings to blue and the height and position so that it's a little bit lower and more forward than the other automatic section labels. And then also use the multiplier here so that I could manually adjust how far that label goes beyond this shoulder. And then I basically found out approximately what that value was and overrode the dimension to a nice even 14 feet. And then just duplicated that over to the other side, flipped the slopes so that the slope was going the other direction. And also used that same folder label technique to take these two adjacent sidewalk sections. I have a 5-foot section here, which has walking pedestrians, and a 3-foot wide section here, which has streetlights as a primary asset. But instead of labeling these individually, I turned these automatic section labels off, added a folder around these two sidewalk pieces next to each other, and used our folder label option to basically add a merged label over both of those sidewalk sections to represent the full 8-foot width of that sidewalk. So that about does it for the major improvements in version 3.0 of Beyond Typicals. If you need any more support with the program, be sure to check out beyondcad.com/tutorials for more videos like this one. And as always, you can head to our Contact Us page or just email me directly at brian@beyondcad.com. Thanks for watching.